Hello everybody. Just thought I'd give you some tips on using R and RStudio and best practices for programming. So in this video I'm going to cover some things including some shortcuts for code development and environments, namespaces, and why you probably don't want to save your workspace image when you close RStudio, and then how to run code from within your R and R Markdown files, and then how to also access documentation so you can figure out how functions work. So the first thing we'll start with are a few tips and tricks for faster development. If you make some code that has something like, we've got a variable, we're going to assign it some values. Let's say we're just pasting together two strings. And if you want to navigate throughout this pretty quickly like that, you can hold down the Control key, or I think Command key in Mac, and then press the arrow keys left and right, and that'll help you move faster through code rather than sitting here scrolling through words. So that's how you can jump around. So right there, to delete that whole line, I just pressed the N key, Shift, the Home key, I selected the whole line and just deleted it. Another thing is tab completion. So this happens in command prompts, terminals in Mac or Linux, and then also in coding environments like RStudio or R, other things like that. So CD will change directory. You can press tab and it will typically autocomplete things. So if you start typing out something, you can press the tab key to have it autocomplete. It does the same thing in R. So if I start typing out a function name, then it will give me some options and I can just press the tab key. So I can press the tab key to autocomplete it, and then I don't have to type the rest of it. So that can be handy if you have a long function name like the term document matrix. Well, I don't have the TM installed yet on this computer, but if you have a longer command you want to type and you don't feel like typing out the whole thing, you can just press tab to complete it. So those are just a few tricks for helping you speed up your workflow a little bit. And now we'll get on to some best coding practices. So when you're coding, you pretty much always want to save your code in an R file or an R Markdown file. And the reason for that is so that you can go back later and reference it. You'll probably end up copying and pasting some snippets and reusing it later. So that's always a good idea, otherwise it's going to be harder to build on your previous work, and it's going to take you longer to do work in the future. So always save your work in a .r or .r Markdown file. You have to do this anyway for the assignments, so that's that. If you want to run lines from here, let's say we want to make a few variables. If you want to run lines in here, you can just put your cursor on that line anywhere in the line, press Control or Command Enter, and it will run it down in the console. So now we've got A in our namespace. And if you want to run multiple lines, you can highlight them, Control Enter will run them. If you want to run the whole file, you click up here on the right, click Source, and then it runs the whole thing. So that's how to run bits of code from the .r file. And so you'll notice when I created these variables, they show up here on the upper right in the global environment. So your environment is where all your variables and functions are stored. So if you click on this drop down, you can see the different parts of the environment that are already loaded. There's the built-in stats package in R that has all these functions and variables that are already there. But in the global environment, we've got these. So this comes down to a problem I've seen where if you close RStudio, I'm going to save this file. So if you close RStudio and then you save your workspace image, which is a bad name for the environment anyway, and then you reopen RStudio, all those variables are still there. Why is that a problem? Well, let's say that I created some variables in my script and then I deleted some lines or reorganized things in my script, and I've saved my workspace image, so I already have these variables A and B in here. If I click source on this file here. So if I click source, it'll compute C from A and B and then print C. So it's printing out 13. The problem is that if I click source, it looks like everything's fine and it runs fine because these variables are already stored in my local environment on my computer. But if I send this to a colleague or submit it for an assignment or something and someone else tries to run it, it's not going to work because A and B are not there. So the solution for this is, if you have saved your environment, it's probably not a good idea to save your environment until you get better at coding and understand things like environments and namespaces a little bit better. So for now, if you already have saved things, you can either click this little cutesy brush icon up here, or you can do remove and you give it a list of things to remove. So ls will list all the variables in your namespace. So if we create a variable, or we create multiple variables, and we do ls, which, by the way, you can press the up arrow to get back to previous commands you've done before. So if we do ls, then it lists out all the variables in our namespace. So this remove list equals ls is just removing and cleaning up all of our things in our environment. If you click the brush icon, it's going to ask you this dialog box. So, alright, so now if we try to source this thing, we get an error because we don't have A or B in there. So anyway, if you've saved variables into your environment, I would clear them with the brush or the rm command and then save your workspace image. And now when you open RStudio, you've got a fresh, clean environment where you're not going to make accidental mistakes of having variables already stored in there. Right, so related to the environment are namespaces, and namespaces are just the collection of symbols that we have that define our variables and our functions. So in our namespace right now, we have all these things from the stats package, all these symbolic placeholders for these different values and functions, and so on. And just one small caveat about namespaces is that if you load two packages that have the same function, like data table and reshape, it will warn you about this, that there are overlapping objects. But there's a command in data table called melt, and there's a command in reshape called melt. So if you load both of those packages, your namespace you're only going to use the latest loaded package for that function. But you can call that function from any package by doing something like this, where you specify the package and then the command. Well, we would need to give it some argument in the melt thing, but anyway, that's how you would call that function specifically from that package. You do the package name and then 2 colons. So that's namespaces in a nutshell. So the other thing I forgot to cover earlier was if you make an R Markdown file, and it says this right in the boilerplate starter Markdown in R Markdown. So if I create an R Markdown file, it'll tell you right here that you can, usually it tells you somewhere, you can press Control Enter to run a single line at a time, or if you want to run a whole code block, you can do Control Shift Enter, and that'll run that whole thing right there. And it'll put the output in right here. So I guess it hides the console. But if you do Control Enter, it'll run it usually through the console. The last thing is accessing the documentation. So I've probably already know this, I hope, but some people have come into the office that are already like nearing the end of the program and they don't know how to access the documentation yet. So the way you can access the help menu, basically, is what it is do a question mark and then a function name. So for example, paste, which is in the base package in R, it tells us how to use it. So this is the list of arguments that we can give it, and then usually at the very bottom it has a bunch of examples. So these are all examples of things you can do, and you usually can just copy them, paste them over here, Guess you might have to run the whole example from the start. But anyway, normally you can run their examples and see how it works for yourself. The other place to go for that is our documentation.org, and this one has a nice interface for it, so you can search all the functions. I was looking for paste and base here. There we go. So if you can, this one is a lot nicer formatted than RStudio, which is kind of bare bones. So that's another place you can go to see the documentation, and this has links. Normally there's links to other parts of the documentation here, also in here. And this one has some community examples sometimes too. Okay, anyway, that's about it. I hope it helps. Please use these tricks and make sure to follow the best practices of creating a .r file for your code so you can save it, as well as keeping your global environment clean so that when you start R, you're not accidentally already starting with some loaded variables that you didn't realize were already loaded. Alright, talk to you next time.